Elephant Run, Chapter 6 through 8. Chapter 6, The Training Camp. The pain in Nick's chest and ribs was bad. He was barely able to take in a full breath without screaming. But this was nothing compared to the embarrassment he felt. Every book he'd read about elephants warned against getting near one without a mahout present. He had not only violated this cardinal rule, he'd done it with a bull elephant wearing an iron bell. He should have slipped into one of the houses until Hannibal had passed through the village. He couldn't believe how stupid he'd been. He was lucky to be alive. Each step up the stairs sent a hot stab of pain throughout his rib cage. When he reached his bathroom, he filled the tub with hot water. Before the war, he had been on his school's rugby team and knew a little something about treating injuries. He took off his shirt, looked in the mirror, and gingerly felt his chest and ribs, wincing in pain. 2 or 3 broken, cracked ribs, maybe 4. He looked at the tub. Taking a scalding hot bath in the middle of an already blistering morning was not his idea of fun, but he knew it was the only thing he could do to stop the muscles from stiffening. After the bath, he felt a little better, but it still took him a long time to get his clothes on, especially his socks and shirt. He was halfway hoping that Mya had gotten tired of waiting and left, so he could go back upstairs and lie down. But when he opened the front door, she was still sitting on the porch. "I'm sorry it took so long." Mya gave him a curt nod, then started down the trail a little faster than Nick would have liked. When she reached the bottom, instead of going left toward the village, she took a trail to the right. "Where are we going?" Nick whined. "Come on, where are we going?" Struggling to keep up with her. "I have to check on Miss Pretty," she called back, and if anything, she started to walk even faster. Nick caught up to her in a small clearing with the stream running through it. He could see the torn-up ground and the barked tree Miss Pretty had been tied to. But she wasn't there now. "Where is she?" "Someone took her away." "Who?" "My father," Mya snapped. "Or another mahout. Is everything all right?" "Yes." It was obvious by her look and tone that she was upset about something. She turned away from him, looking like she was on the verge of tears. Nick wanted to do something, but he had no idea what that might be. He took a step toward her. Is there anything Mya turned around. "Are there mahouts in Britain?" Nick stopped. No. Why?" "In America?" "No. I mean, they have elephants in zoos in both countries, but are women allowed to take care of them?" "I don't know. I guess so if they wanted to." "Not here," Mya said sharply. "Only men can become mahouts." Nick didn't know why she was snapping at him. He wasn't responsible for Burmese customs. She crossed a small stream and started to walk away. "Where are you going now?" he asked. "To the elephant training camp," she said without looking back. "Are you coming?" "I guess so. How far away is it?" "Not far." Nick learned that not far to Mya was about 6 miles. His father had written to him about the terrible heat, but the letters had not prepared him for this. Each breath of hot, humid air seared his lungs as if they were being parboiled, and the cracked ribs were not helping matters. He began to seriously doubt he would have the strength to make it back to Hawk's Nest after they got to wherever they were going. As they approached the camp, they heard men's voices, but the talk ended abruptly when Mya and Nick stepped into view. There were a dozen mahouts sitting around a small fire, smoking cheroots and drinking tea. The man glared at the intruders in suspicious silence. Nick glanced at Mya. She seemed surprised at their icy reception, and he was as well. One of the men got up from the circle, threw his cheroot in the dust, crushed it with his bare feet. and started shouting at Mya in Burmese. Nick didn't understand what he was saying, but his message was reflected perfectly in Mya's stunned and embarrassed expression. They weren't welcome here. What's he saying? Nick demanded, his Freestone blood boiling to the surface. Mya started to answer, but was cut off by the man before she got a single word out. I was telling Mya that the women are not allowed in the training camp, he said in perfect English. A fact that she knows well. Mya's cheeks flushed and she bowed her head. That's no reason to shout at her, Nick said, and our presence here is actually my fault. Mya looked up. I asked her to bring me here. I apologize if I violated one of your customs, but I just arrived last night and I could not have possibly found this camp on my own. The man walked up to Nick and stopped an inch from his chest. What are you doing here, then? Nick straightened up as the best he could with his sore ribs. My name is Nick Freestone, and I assume I'm free to go wherever I please on the plantation, with whomever I please. And you are? Mogwai, the man said. The name sounded familiar. Am I wrong about going where I please? Nick asked. Mogwai didn't answer. His attention had been drawn away by something just beyond Nick's right shoulder. Nick turned and saw the monk from that morning standing at the edge of the clearing. The other mahouts quickly got to their feet and bowed their heads. The monk returned their bow, then approached. Mogwai lowered his head and started speaking quietly in Burmese. Use English, Mogwai, the monk said. The boy does not speak our language. Nick looked at the monk in surprise. Why hadn't he used English when they'd met on the trail earlier? Mogwai explained that Nick and Mya's sudden appearance had startled the men, and that was why he had been upset. Nick began to protest, but remembered his mother's warning about the Freestone blood and stopped himself. Mr. Freestone himself, Mogwai continued, usually gives us some warning before he pays a visit. This way there's time to prepare the camp, and Mr. Freestone would never bring a female here. It's well known that their presence will upset the gnats and bring bad luck. The monk regarded Mogwai with mild distaste as he listened to his explanation. When Mogwai finished, the monk turned to Mya and smiled with obvious affection. Mya returned the smile, then bowed. There have been women in the training camp before, the monk said, and I don't recall the gnats causing any mischief because of it. What women have been here? Mogwai asked. Mrs. Freestone, for one, the monk answered. She used to come here often. She liked watching the elephants being trained. This was news to Nick. He was under the impression that his mother didn't like elephants. She had hardly even mentioned visiting the training camp. That was a long time ago, Mogwai said. A far-off look came into the monk's eyes. For me, it seems like yesterday. I don't think the gnats will mind Mya being here. But I am wondering why you're here today, Mogwai. Mogwai shifted uneasily. We were just passing by, he said. With Nang busy and Inda gone, I thought I should duck in on the calves. I saw Mya not an hour ago, the monk said calmly. He was wondering where you were. He said that you and your mahouts were supposed to be on Sway Hill working. In 2 hours, it would be too hot for your elephants. Perhaps you should go to your assigned area. We were on our way there when Mya and the boy arrived, Mogwai said. Nick bit his tongue. They weren't on their way anywhere when he and Mogwai got there. Let's get back to work, Mogwai said, and walked over to a line of elephants tied to a picket at the edge of the clearing. Several of the men joined him. They untied the elephants, clambered up on their backs, and rode off into the forest without another word. As Nick watched them leave, he wondered who this monk was. My mother used to come up to the training camp? The monk smiled. It was your grandmother who enjoyed watching the elephants, he answered. Her name was Mrs. Freestone, too. "This morning on the path," Nick said, "you didn't speak." "I was practicing walking meditation," the monk said. Nick nodded, although he had no idea what walking meditation was. After Magwe left, most of the remaining mahouts dropped their surly attitudes. The monk followed along silently as the head elephant trainer, Tin, showed Mya and Nick around the camp. The two 5-year-old elephant calves were being held in the center of the camp in small enclosures made of logs. "The enclosure is called an elephant crush," Tin explained, "which is very much like the cattle chutes you use in America. It doesn't crush them, of course. It confines the calf so that we can get around it safely until it learns to accept our presence." "How do you restrain larger elephants?" Nick was thinking of Hannibal, who had been much bigger than these calves when he was captured. "We put them in bigger crushes," Tin answered happily. "Where are their mothers?" "We fettered them on the far side of the plantation so they wouldn't come here to rescue their calves." "Does that happen?" "Oh, yes," Tin said. "Mothers are fond of their babies." The calves were both about 5 feet tall and seemed to have adjusted to the separation. The mahouts constantly talked to them as they demonstrated what the elephants had learned. "Pick up your pretty feet." "Humped, humped." Lie down. The ground is soft." "La, la, come, come. I have a treat for you of tamarind and salt." "A timber elephant is trained its entire life," Tin explained. "When it goes into the forest with its mother, the calf learns by watching her move logs. We call this period CAH, or calf at heels. At age 5, they begin their formal training. The calves will be here for 3 or 4 months. We will teach them to lie down, to come, pick up objects with their trunks. We introduce them to the saddle, or the ondon, and the padding that goes beneath it." There was a pile of padding lying next to the crush. Nick bent down and touched it. "It feels like bark," he said. "The padding is called faye," Tin explained. "It comes from the bobway tree. It protects the elephant's back from chafing and sores." Nick stood up. "What happened after they accept the saddle?" "We get them used to having a mahout on their neck and teach them the meaning of the feet and toe commands we use to guide them. When they leave here, they will become baggage elephants for 12 or 13 years, until they are strong enough to work in the forest as timber elephants." Altogether, there are 8 elephants in the camp. The oldest is a 22-year-old bull named Boshin. "Why is he here?" Nick asked. "The rage is upon him," Tim answered. "He's in mush, or as we call it in Burmese, gnome." Nick had read about mush. Once a year, bull elephants went into a period of temporary madness and became very aggressive, attacking mahouts, other elephants, and anything else that got in the way. The only remedy for the condition was to tie the elephant to a stout tree under the mush, which usually took about a month. All 4 of Boshin's legs were roped. The area in which he was tied looked as if a cyclone had passed through it. The bull had uprooted every bush and plant within reach and had plowed the ground around him into a soft loam with his heavy tusks. He did not like being there. As they approached, he started straining against his ropes in an effort to get at them. Tim stopped 20 feet from the furthest reach of his trunk. In another 2 weeks, he should be back to his former self. Nick found it difficult to believe that Boshin would ever be back to normal. His eyes bulged with murderous fury. Both temples were swollen, oozing a thick, yellowish discharge that strained the side of his head. Nick shuddered, realizing that he wouldn't be alive now had Hannibal been in mush. Perhaps we should leave him alone, Mya suggested. Nick couldn't have agreed more. The tree Boshin was roped to did not look substantial enough to hold him. He followed Mya back to the calves and sat beside her on a log. She stared at the calves in much the same way she had stared at Miss Pretty through the rear window of the truck. It was almost as if she were commuting to memory every movement they made. Magwe is a bully, Nick said. Mya turned to him. You didn't have to defend me like you did. Nick wasn't sure if she was thanking him or criticizing him. Who is he? A mahout. He seemed to have a lot of influence over the other mahouts. Mya shrugged. His family has been here a long time. His grandfather is one of the 2 mahouts who came from the sergeant major. Oh, of course, Nick thought. That's why the name sounded familiar. His father had mentioned Magwe in a few of his letters. And the monk? Tanba, Mya said. Hilltop. Nick gawked at her, then looked back to the monk, who was still standing with Tin near Boshin. Are you saying that the monk is actually the Hilltop? Mya nodded. Your great-grandfather? Mya nodded again. He'd have to be close to 100 years old. Some say older. I was told he left the plantation when the sergeant major was still here. 60 years ago, Mya said, but he came back. When? When I was a little girl. You're kidding me. Mya shook her head. Surely there was no one in the village who could recognize him after 60 years, he said. How do you know it's really him? The monk stepped closer to the mad Boshin. He put his hand on one of his tusks and leaned his old shaved head toward the bull's ear as if he were saying something to him. Because Hilltop can speak to the elephants, Mya answered, and the elephants understand. Chapter 7, Inda. Nang did not come home all night, so Mya couldn't ask him about his intentions for Miss Pretty. But she did find out that it was he who had taken the elephant the day before to do his plantation rounds. This meant he had not picked a mahout for Miss Pretty. There was still hope. As soon as she rolled up her sleeping mat, she went next door and told Kin that she was going out to find her father. I want you to stay in the village, her aunt said. Hannibal was here yesterday, you know. It would be hard not to know. When Mya returned from the training camp, the entire village was in an uproar over Hannibal. No one had actually seen him, but his footprints were easy to spot because of their size and the missing toenail on his right front foot. Magwe ranted for nearly an hour about how Mr. Freestone should have destroyed Hannibal long ago. He promised that he would keep track of Hannibal, Magwe reminded everyone loudly. In addition to having Hannibal wear the iron bell, Mr. Freestone had promised to send Nang or Inda into the forest to check on Hannibal every few days. If Hannibal was getting too close to the village, they would drive him away, or use a kanji to drag him away if necessary. With her father busy and Inda away with Mr. Freestone, no one had checked Hannibal's whereabouts in the past week. Mya did not know what all the fuss was about. All he had done was walk through the village. Other timber elephants did this every day, and it had been at least 3 years since Hannibal had caused any trouble. Magwe was so worried about Hannibal returning that he posted children in the trees at the outskirts of the village to watch for them. He announced that when the Japanese came, he would take care of Hannibal once and for all. We're going to clean your father's house, Kin said. You can begin by sweeping the porch. I will start inside. Kin, a normally calm and cheerful woman, seemed unusually tense to Mya this morning. Hannibal lurking near the village was a worry, but it didn't fully explain her aunt's mood. Mya finished sweeping the porch and had just started on the stairs when she heard a familiar laugh a few houses down from theirs. "Indah's back!" she shouted, throwing her broom down and running toward the sound. As always, a large group of people were gathered around her brother. "So," Indah was telling the group with a bright smile, "Hannibal came through yesterday, and he didn't push a house over or kill anyone?" Several people nodded. "Then it seems to me that our rogue is showing signs of getting better. Perhaps the tiger gnat has left him." Mogwai joined the group. "And perhaps," he said, "Hannibal didn't kill anyone because there was no one here for him to kill. We were all at the pagoda yesterday when he came through." Indah's smile didn't falter, but his eyes lost some of their merriment at the sight of Mogwai. "Yes, I heard. I'm very sorry I wasn't there." "Where were you?" Mogwai asked, with an undisguised suspicion. "Plantation business," Indah answered without pause. "Which reminds me, Mr. Freestone wants to see you up at Hawk's Nest." "Why?" "You'll have to ask him," Indah answered, "and I wouldn't keep him waiting." Mogwai gave Indah a casual shrug, as if this were not an unusual request, but everyone there knew it was. With the exception of Nang and Indah, mahouts were rarely summoned or asked to come to Hawk's Nest. Mogwai left the group and started up the path. Indah watched him go, then turned to Mya. "I heard you were at the training camp yesterday." There were no secrets on the plantation. "I had every right to be there," Mya said defensively. "Father asked me to show Nick Freestone around, and the training camp is—" Indah held his hand up with an affectionate grin. "You were lucky Hilltop showed up when he did, but of course, he has a knack for that." He turned back to the group. "Don't worry about Hannibal. I'm sure he's a long way from here by now. But just to make sure, I'll track him down and find out what he's up to." He took Mya's hand and started walking to the house. When they were far away enough, he asked her what Nick Freestone was like. "He sweats a lot," Mya answered, "and he's fat. I was afraid he was going to collapse on the way from camp to the village." Indah laughed. "He'll lose weight here. And as to sweating, it was probably snowing in London when he left. He'll get used to the weather." Mya wasn't sure. "He said he fell on the trail and injured himself." "How?" "I didn't see it, but he was very stiff afterward. On the way back from the training camp, he was moving very slowly and could barely walk." "It must have been more serious than he let on." "He said that you were at Hawk's Nest yesterday." "Briefly." "Why didn't you come down to the village to see me?" Mya scolded. "There wasn't time." "What's going on, Indah?" "What do you mean?" "Everyone is acting strangely. Kin, father, you." "What do you think of Miss Pretty?" Indah asked with a grin. "You're changing the subject," Mya said, smiling, "but she's beautiful." "She ought to be. Mr. Freestone went to a lot of expenses to get her here." "Why?" Mya asked hopefully. "Shh, not now," Indah said with a devilment in his eyes. They had reached their father's house, and Kin was standing on the porch with her back to them, hanging up the wash. Indah ran up the stairs and hugged her from behind. She screamed like a young girl and started slapping and pushing him away, trying not to laugh and failing. "Is there any food in my father's house?" Indah asked. "The only thing my disrespectful nephew thinks about is his stomach." Mya followed him inside. There was a bag filled with clothes sitting in the middle of the bamboo floor. Rolled up next to it was Mya's sleeping mat. "What's this?" she asked. "We're going on a trip, little sister," Indah answered, "with Miss Pretty." Mya would have jumped for joy if Kin hadn't started weeping. Chapter 8. The Christmas Ride. Nick sat up and groaned. With difficulty, he got out of bed and made his way to the bathroom, slowly. It was hard to tell where one ache ended and the other began. He and Mya had left the training camp soon after Hilltop had worked his miracle on Boshin. Nick still wasn't convinced that the monk was one of the two original mahouts, but there was no denying the remarkable change in the bull after the monk spoke to him. Tin and the other mahouts were hand-feeding Boshin by the time Nick had left the camp. When he stumbled into Hawk's Nest after the tour, dinner was waiting for him. He ate by himself at the long dining table. But he wasn't alone. Bu Kong, the head houseman and servant, stood close by, watching every forkful of food he put into his mouth, which made Nick a little uncomfortable. When he finished it, he asked Bu Kong about Hilltop. "A very holy man," Bu Kong said. "Well, where did he go when he left the plantation?" "Some say he returned to India. Some say he went up into the mountains to stay in a monastery. And still others insist that he never left at all, that he stayed right here in the form of an elephant until that elephant passed away and gave him back to us." Nick seriously doubted that, but he didn't say so. "Does Hilltop live in the village?" "Oh, no, he lives in the forest." "Where?" Bu Kong shrugged his shoulders. "No one really knows." Nick found this a little hard to believe as well. Why did he leave the plantation all those years ago? His wife and youngest daughter were attacked by a tiger. "Like Hannibal," Nick said. "Yes, but far worse. They were killed. After that, Hilltop shaved his head and devoted his life to the Buddha." Perhaps Mother's fear of tigers was warranted, Nick thought. He wasn't Bu Kong. He asked Bu Kong about the Japanese invading Burma. "They will be here soon, I think." "How soon?" "I can't say." "What do you think about the Japanese?" "Some want to see the British out of our country. Some want to see them stay." "I hardly think the Japanese would be better than the British," Nick said. Bu Kong smiled. "Yes, but the Japanese have promised to give us our independence." He started to clear the table. "If you'll excuse me, I have things to attend to." He limped off into the kitchen. Nick thought about all that he said as he soaked in the tub. His father wanted Burmese independence too. During his last trip to London, he had lobbied Parliament on behalf of several plantation owners for Burmese independence. But the politicians turned a deaf ear to his pleas, and the newspapers attacked him, stopping just short of calling him a traitor. Nick came down the stairs a little easier than he'd gone up the night before, but he was still very sore. When he got to the entry hall, he heard voices coming from the library. The door was open, and two servants were lingering outside, pretending to clean, though it looked to Nick like they were eavesdropping. When they saw him, they gave embarrassed bows and scurried away. Nick walked into the library without knocking. His father was sitting at the helm of the big desk. He had shaved, and his clothes were clean and crisp. He still looked tired, but much improved from the day before. He was glaring at the man sitting across from him with such intensity that he didn't notice Nick come in. The man said something in Burmese. His father responded in Burmese, and although Nick could not understand the meaning of the words, the harshness with which they were spoken was clear. His Freestone blood was up. Nick started to back out of the library, but his father saw him. "Nick?" Good morning," Nick stammered. "I'm sorry, No, please come in." "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas," Nick said, but it didn't seem anything like Christmas. "I'd like you to meet—" The man stood and turned. "Magwe," Nick said. "We met yesterday at the elephant training camp." Magwe smiled, then bowed as if he and Nick were the best of friends. Nick returned the bow, but not as deeply, and he didn't smile. I was just telling Magwe that we were taking you on a plantation tour, his father said. We'll be gone for a few days. It didn't sound like that at all. It didn't sound like he was telling him anything like that. 3 hours later, Nick sat behind his father, hanging onto the elephant saddle for dear life. Their elephant's name was Chu Chin Chow, Chow for short, and no matter how Nick shifted positions, each step the bull took jarred every bone in his body. His father didn't seem bothered in the least by the elephant's awkward gait, nor did Mya and Inda, who were about 50 feet in front of them on Miss Pretty. Every once in a while, Nick's father turned around to point out a tree shrub or an animal or a landmark. Cobra, bad dispositions, stay clear of them. Make sure to check for snakes before you sit down or hang your hammock. If you get a full load of venom, you won't last the night. Pangolin, harmless insectivore. The young have the same armor plating, but in miniature. Their mothers carry them on their backs. But for the most part, they ambled along in silence, which was fine with Nick. It saved him the bother of disguising his discomfort, which was getting worse and worse with each step Chow took. If it didn't improve, he was going to have to confess that he had happened to run into Hannibal and risk becoming the laughingstock of the plantation. They rode throughout the morning without stopping, cutting through dense bamboo stands, over blistering hot clearings, across cool streams, which Nick would have gladly jumped into given half a chance. It was so hot. At times it seemed like they were going in large circles, but it was hard for Nick to tell because everything looked remarkably the same. Wild pigs, his father said, pointing to the right. It took Nick a while to pick them out in the dense brush. There were at least a dozen in the group standing stock still, not 20 feet away. They're good eating and plentiful in the jungle, his father continued, but the boars can be dangerous, especially when wounded. Food and survival seemed to be the theme of the tour, without any mention of teak, elephants, or plantation management, which is what Nick thought they would be discussing. Do you shoot? His father asked. I beg your pardon? Do you know how to use a rifle? Nick's mother hadn't liked guns, and there wasn't much opportunity for target practice in London, although he had always wanted to learn. Not really, he said. We'll try to take care of that then. And a little after 12 p.m., they came to a wide, shallow river and stopped. His father started untying various bundles and tossing them down to Inda and Mya, who had arrived well ahead of them. When he finally finished, he nimbly jumped to the ground. Nick dismounted too, but not nearly as gracefully. He hit the hard ground on his butt and nearly passed out from the pain in his ribs. Fortunately, his father was busy and didn't see it, but Inda did. He rushed over. Are you all right? Fine, Nick said, which wasn't even close to the truth. Inda grinned and helped him up. I remember the first time I spent the day clinging to an elephant saddle. I can barely walk when I get off. Man, it takes a while to get used to it. Nick had been fully prepared to dislike Inda because of his father's obvious affections for him. But upon meeting him that morning, he found it impossible not to like him. The way he smiled, his mannerisms, and his good humor were infectious. Is it more comfortable on the neck? Nick asked. Inda nodded. But that also takes some getting used to. Nick wiped some of the dust from the seat of his pants and winced in pain. "Are you sure you're all right?" Inda asked. "Mya tells me that you had an accident on the trail yesterday." "Yeah, I slipped." "Did you tell your father?" "No." I wouldn't have told my father either," Inda said. "You didn't break anything?" I don't think so. I'm just a little sore." Inda stared at him in silence, clearly waiting for Nick to elaborate. "Well," Nick admitted, "very sore." He wanted to tell him what had really happened. He felt Inda would understand, but there was nothing to be gained by admitting how stupid he'd been. "When we start again," Inda said, "would you like to ride up with me on Miss Pretty?" "I'd like that," Nick answered. "Where are we exactly?" "The river is called Taka." Inda pointed across to the other side of the river. "And it's not the shore you're looking at. It's a huge island with just as much river on the other side." Nick looked across at the dense, thick forest. "Is it part of the plantation?" "Yes," his father said, joining them. "Freestone Island. It's what all the land looked like when the sergeant major arrived, your great-great-grandfather. Wild, untouched. He wanted to keep the island that way so that we would remember how the plantation started. It's like a maze in there, and very easy to get lost. So many trees in that forest and on the island. No one's allowed across unless I give them permission. We'll go over when it cools down. I wanted you to see it before." He hesitated and looked at Inda. "Where's Mya?" "She took Miss Pretty down river to give her a bath," he answered. His father nodded and looked back at Nick. "Inda and I are going to see if we can find Hannibal." "Hannibal's near here?" Nick tried to keep the panic out of his voice. "We've been tracking him all day," Inda said. "There's a stream not far from here where he likes to hide. I think he's there." "We'll take Chow," his father said. "He and Hannibal are old friends. I'd ask you to come with us, but dealing with Hannibal can be a little dicey." "I'll be fine here." Nick had absolutely no desire to go looking for Hannibal. "Depending on how cooperative he is," his father continued, "we'll cross over to the island in an hour or so. If we encounter problems, we'll camp here and go over tomorrow morning after we catch him." "We're taking Hannibal to the island with us?" His father nodded. "We need to get him as far from the village as we can. If you get a chance, you might want to start a fire. We could use a cup of tea." Nick watched them walk away, then found the tea kettle among the supplies and walked to the shore. Mya stood in the cool river up to her knees, scooping water with a bucket and splashing it over the prone Miss Pretty. "Can I help?" Mya turned around. "If you like." He rolled up his pants and waded out to join them. The cool water felt wonderful on his bare legs. "What can I do?" "We use sand to scrub the elephant's skin." She demonstrated by scooping up a handful from the bottom of the river and rubbing it into Miss Pretty's gray skin, then rinsing it off. The cow seemed to love the bath, making satisfied high-pitched squeaks. When they finished the first side, Mya used her chun to give Miss Pretty to her feet, then laid her back down on the other side. It took nearly an hour to scrub Miss Pretty down, and despite Nick's injured ribs, he enjoyed every minute of it. They tied Miss Pretty to a tree where she could browse. Then Nick walked upriver to fill the kettle with water while Mya got the fire started. The elephant bath had not only cooled him down, it had helped him regain some of his self-confidence. The hit by Hannibal had done more than crack his ribs. He decided to ask his father if he could spend a week or two in the elephant training camp. If he was going to run the plantation one day when he was older, He would have to learn a lot more about elephants. Myan knew 100 times more than he did, and she wasn't even a mahout. Nick looked up from where he was filling the kettle and noticed a snag in the middle of the river with a vulture perched on it. The bird was eating something. He put the kettle down and waited for a closer look, happy for another excuse to get wet. The vulture flew off, leaving behind a monkey carcass. Other than its eyes being pecked out, the monkey looked relatively fresh. "What do you see?" his father shouted from the shore. Nick turned around. His father and Inda were back, and they weren't alone. Hannibal had a loose rope around his neck, tied to Chow's saddle. Sitting on top of Hannibal, with a cloth bag over his shoulder and carrying an old chun, was Hilltop. "A dead monkey!" Nick shouted back. Nick's father slipped off Chow's back, said something to Inda and the monk, then walked over to the edge of the water. He took his boots off and waded out to the snag. "I guess Hannibal was feeling cooperative," Nick said. His father smiled. "Chow's small, but he can be very convincing, and it didn't hurt him to have Hilltop there." "Is Hilltop really one of the original mahouts?" "He is." "When did he come back?" "Right after you and your mother left." "Where was he all those years?" "Traveling, seeking enlightenment." "How old is he?" "Old. But as you can see, age doesn't seem to have slowed him down very much." They looked over at Inda and Hilltop. Inda was tying Chow to a tree. Hilltop was standing beside Hannibal, talking to him. "So, Hannibal's in a good mood?" Nick said. "Yeah, much better than yesterday morning at the village when he knocked you down." Nick looked up in shock. "How did you know?" "I just found out. Hilltop saw the whole thing. He followed you down from Hawk's Nest. You should have told me." Nick shook his head. "I was stupid." "No, you were lucky." "Did Hilltop tell anyone else?" "Just Inda and me. Hilltop's about the only person on the plantation who keeps his own counsel. We'll keep it quiet to protect Hannibal." "Protect him how?" "If certain villagers found out about the attack, by the end of the day the story would be that Hannibal had gone on a rampage and tried to impale you with his broken tusk. There are those in the village who don't like me and will do anything in their power to undermine my authority. It's well known that I'm rather fond of Hannibal, in spite of his sour disposition. They can get at me by getting at him." "Magwe," Nick said. His father nodded. "He's one of them. Why don't you just kick him off the plantation?" "He's a conniving little weasel, but the truth is, I like him when he isn't trying to take over the plantation. And I have to think of Magwe's family, which is rather large. If I booted him out, they would feel obligated to leave as well. It would be difficult for them to find work. I'm responsible for them." Nick looked toward shore. Inda and Hilltop were hand-feeding Hannibal tamarind branches. Mr. Freestone followed his gaze. Hannibal is not the rogue everyone thinks he is. He's dangerous, to be sure, but yesterday morning he was just showing you who's boss. He could have killed you, but he chose not to." "It was terrifying," Nick admitted. "There's no harm in getting knocked down by an elephant. I've lost count of how many times it's happened to me. Did he break anything?" "I'm not sure. My ribs are bothering me. I'll wrap them up good and tight before we cross over to the island. Now, let's take a look at this monkey." He broke a stick off the snag and started probing the swollen corpse. "Did it drown?" Father shook his head. "It was shot." "Shot?" "Twice." He used the stick to point out the 2 gunshot wounds. Why would anyone shoot a monkey? To stop someone from eating it. You're kidding. The hill tribes eat monkeys during the bad times, and I'm afraid there are bad times coming in Burma. What are you talking about? Let's get out of the water, his father said. They waded back to shore. As they were pulling on their boots, his father said, "The Japanese are here." Near the plantation? Yes, but not in any great number yet. He nodded toward the snag. I suspect the Japanese shot that monkey upriver. The soldiers are killing the hill tribes' food. If the tribes get hungry enough, they'll join the Japanese, and that's what the Japanese want. Nick shook his head in bewilderment. 2 years of bombings, their apartment destroyed. He'd had his fill of war. Why do the Japanese want Burma? They need it more to move supplies in and out of China. They're going to fight hard to take it, his father paused. And I think they're going to win. But surely our soldiers, his father shook his head, we don't have the manpower to beat them. And most of the Burmese want the Japanese to win, which is our fault. The Japanese slogan is Asia for Asians. We should have given the Burmese their independence long ago, or at least promised it to them after the war. But we built this country up, Nick protested. Any prosperity the Burmese have is because of people like you and grandfather and the sergeant major. We've worked hard, but so have the Burmese, he said, and this is their country, not ours. He tied his bootlaces and got to his feet. The situation is bad. We spotted a scouting patrol not 5 miles from the plantation yesterday. He took a deep breath, then locked his brown eyes on Nick. I made a serious mistake in bringing you over here. We thought you would be safer with me, away from the bombings. I wanted to come here, Nick said. His father looked away. I'm afraid your stay will be shorter than either of us expected. I'm sending you to Australia. I have a good friend in Alice Springs, and he's offered to look after you until this is all over. Mia is going with you. Nick was too shocked to speak. It's not safe here anymore, his father continued in a rush. Before you arrived in Rangoon, I had Nang try to find a way to get you to the States or back to London, but everything was booked. People were leaving the country in droves. There wasn't a ship or an airplane seat to be had. I only wish I'd figured this out before, I left to come here. The only way now is over land to India. Inda will take you and Mia on Miss Pretty. From there you'll board a ship for Darwin. What about the plantation? It's lost, his father answered, at least for the time being. Perhaps after the war we'll be able to come back. In the meantime, I'm leaving Nang in charge of things here. What about you? He glanced away. I'll be staying here. To do what? To fight the Japanese. But you just said it was hopeless. The Burmese want the Japanese here. I said that most of the Burmese want the Japanese here, not all of them. And those who do will change their minds after they find out what the Japanese are all about. Inda and I will be leading a small group of men to make things difficult for the Japanese during their stay. We'll also be gathering intelligence and sending it to the Allies. So when they decide to take Burma back, they'll be better prepared. I was born and raised here. I know a lot more about this jungle than the Japanese. I'll be fine. So will I, Nick said. I'm not going to Australia. I'm not giving you a choice, Nicholas. It's Nick, and there are people younger than me fighting in this war. Inda isn't much older than I am. True, but you weren't raised here. It takes a long time to get acclimated. Some people never adjust to this country. He pointed to Nick's ribs. and you're not in any shape to be running around the jungle. I'll be fine in a few weeks. His father shook his head. With luck, you'll be in India in a few weeks, and Alice Springs a week or two after that. You're not going back to Hawk's Nest. You're leaving for India tomorrow. Tomorrow? This Christmas tour was just a ruse to get you and Mya away without panicking the villagers, he said. If they knew I was pulling up stakes this early in the game, it's hard to say what they would do. Nick glanced over at Mya and Inda sitting near the fire. Does Mya know? She was told this morning. I asked her not to say anything until I had a chance to talk to you. She's as unhappy about the situation as you are. Maybe more so. She's never been farther away than Rangoon, which is another reason you need to go. She'll need your help. Nick doubted it. Mya didn't appear to need anyone's help, especially his. So, you're not taking us to India? His father shook his head. I can't. They could be here in force any day. By the time Inda returns, Burma will have fallen. He looked across the river. But before you leave, we'll go to the island and let Hannibal go. Why are you letting him go? Because that's where he was captured, and if we don't let him go, he'll be killed. The Japanese or someone from the village will make sure of that. We also need to determine how many elephants the island can hold. The military wants to kill our elephants so they can't be used by the Japanese. I won't do that. Killing an elephant is like killing a person, as far as I'm concerned. Over the next few weeks, Nang and some of the other mahouts are going to take our best elephants secretly over to the island and set them free. His father stood up. Let's get your ribs wrapped up. Wait a second, Nick protested. That's it? No more discussion? His father shook his head. There's nothing more to say, Nick.